Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Wonderful to come to Sri Lanka for the first time. I think for most of us here this morning, we've all traveled great distances, endured lack of sleep, and probably some bad airline food in between. So I appreciate everyone's showing up this morning to participate. First, let me thank Dakota Dobbins, and Maria for your help and support in certainly the invitation to join you today, but your help with putting the presentations together for us. As I said, first time in Sri Lanka. I find it to be a magical place. It seems to have another surprise around every bend in the road. Yesterday I went down to Galle. I endured the local scenic tour down to Galle, and it was just really amazing. I came back the expressway, as you can appreciate, but in the process saw just a little snapshot of what I think is truly a beautiful country. My job this morning is to kick off the conference and to inspire you to think deeply about our respective roles in agri-finance and how we can effectively share and leverage our collective resources. And coincidentally, our theme for the conference of process, products, and people. So let's get started. I'd be remiss if I didn't share with you just a little bit on Rabobank as we get started. I know my colleague Hans Borgaard will be here a little bit before lunch to talk in more detail about Rabobank. But for those who aren't familiar with us, we are a Dutch cooperative bank with about a 120-year history, originally started as a farmers bank in Holland, financing the first farmers in the Netherlands, first commercial farmers. And from that point forward, we've had a very deep commitment to food and agribusiness. Today, we're a top 30 bank in the world with close to 900 billion in assets. And those assets across 45 different countries with a full suite of financial services from merger and acquisition to capital markets, wholesale lending, trade commodity finance, and what we call global client solutions. We are amongst the highest rated bank in the world, being farmers and financing farmers. We've always had a very conservative view of the financing markets. And as a result, we have one of the highest credit ratings of any commercial bank in the world. Very proud history. We're very proud of our F&A roots. What I want to talk to you about this morning is really how supply chains have changed, how they're becoming a strategic issue in food and agri. This slide doesn't come as any surprise, certainly. Global food commodities have really moved into an era of scarcity. Over the last decade, you can see this is grain prices, wheat, corn, and soybean. And you can just see how we've moved from back in the early 2000s from surplus to the mid-2000, 2012 period, tightening of supply. And we really now see prices moving higher and with more volatility. So again, moving from surplus to scarcity. There are really what I see as four key drivers for this. I mean, I think the first are pretty self-evident: higher prices and volatility, shifting market power and margins. Feeding 9 billion people. But really what's perhaps the latest development is what we've called the great crossover. And this is really the development of more complexity in the food and ag supply chain. It's not just limited to price anymore. It's really about, the complexity of food supply, demand, combined with sort of external agendas now, political, trade, and social development. And this has made F&A this has given us a much more important role to play. It's no longer as just about price. It's all the other agendas that come along with that. And as agri prices have risen, so has outside interest from all stakeholders. This isn't, this concept isn't new, certainly. and the individual elements are all well known. There are really 4 outside agendas today that influence our dynamics in supply and demand within F&A. It's finance, it's sustainability, it's health, and it's energy. The complexity of these has created much more pressure than we've ever seen. In finance, it's really about the volatility, and that brought risk management tools in. We've seen hedge funds, and a whole host of financial products built around trying to manage the price volatility and risk. Health issues, obesity's issues on F&A. In the U.S., more than 30% of U.S. adults are considered obese, 8% have diabetes, and 17% of children in the U.S. are diagnosed as obese. So there's certainly tremendous pressure from the health aspects affecting our F&A environment. The U.S. is now the world's largest health food market, about $150 billion, or 20% of total retail sales now in health food. Sustainability, whether it's the people, products, and planet, this is, for many of us, this is part of our DNA, but for others, this is a relatively, daunting challenge that people are just getting their heads wrapped around. Lastly, energy. Agri-commodities for feedstocks, the food versus fuel debate has continued to really drive added pressure within F&A. Our global supply chains require more energy. I think the FAO projects about a 50% increase in food production needed by 2030. That's going to require much, much more efficient energy use. And I think leading F&A companies are responding to pressure. As someone who I spent my entire career in beverages, I've come to see the beverage industry as embracing some of these kind of key agenda issues. Supply chain management, is far more complex, but small stakeholders are a particular focus for F&A companies, and I think these are 3 representative examples where Starbucks, Nestle, and the Coca-Cola Company have each made strong initiatives to really build a base of support all the way upstream to the farm level. For Starbucks, a great example is what they're doing in Yunnan province now, training coffee farmers in China, taking what's historically been a tea culture and helping farmers to adapt to the new demands of coffee around the world. Nestle has done a tremendous job in many different areas. One that I think of is certainly their work with basmati rice in India. Coca-Cola Company also has a deep passion for working with small stakeholders all the way back to the farm level. And these are all relatively new initiatives. The key question that I think big brand owners today are asking about their supply chains, fundamentally, the fundamentals haven't changed, but it's now the need to deliver more. And historically, it's always been about quality and price. Can the supply chain deliver on the fundamentals? That's been the basic question. But increasingly, it's going beyond that. Now it's about protecting and growing margins. It certainly is about security of supply. It's supporting growth. Is my supply chain able to really grow into these new markets, particularly new emerging markets with new products and new geographies? And can it be done safely and sustainably? Can my supply chain deliver on my product attributes? And last but not least, strengthening the weakest link. We're only as strong as that. So consequently, supply chain managers today are asking, how can I strengthen the weakest link? And in doing so, strengthen the entire supply chain. So these fundamental changes are underway across the entire F&A sector. For chain partner engagement, it's really gone from what was traditionally negotiation over price. It's now becoming far more collaborative. And the significance of these relationships has really moved with that from what was a transactional relationship buyer and seller, kind of diametrically opposed, to now we view it has to be much more transformational, where buyer and seller sit down, recognize their differences, recognize where they have common interests and shared values, and focusing on those and not just price. I think we can all recognize the dynamics here. Increasing supply chain cooperation, it presents a real dilemma. This is the issue of, who's going to win, buyer or seller. And it's just not that easy, and there has to be a better way. In our view, the winning strategy is cooperation between companies in the supply chain, leading to what we talk about as a circular economy model. Let me explain a little bit more about what I mean by that. Closer cooperation can really come in I think, three forms. There's, what has been the historical in the lower left quadrant. That's really carried us over the last 5 years. This, what I call open market sourcing. And then if you look to the far right, this is what we see as the long-term goal in supply chain direction, and that is this circular economy model, where it's a circular relationship between suppliers, brand owners, and it's effectively a make, improve, and renew model. The focus is on cooperation to increase value with everyone in the supply chain. And that's the ambition, but that's a long way out. That's 5 years out. And to get there, we think there's an interim step, a step that we call dedicated supply chains that we see today carrying us over the next 2 to 3 years. And dedicated supply chains are really a little bit more linear. It's more about, taking what has historically been a take, make, use, and waste model, very linear, with a lot of inefficiency and waste, and creating an interim step by creating greater alignment and a greater shared values through the value chain. And in doing so, resources are given elevated value, waste is reduced, new opportunities exist for supply chain financing as they become more efficient, there's decreased risk, and more value added created. Businesses are organized and financed differently along the value chain today and historically, and what we're looking for is a much more holistic view on how partners can interact with each other. So a different way of looking at this is this slide. So on the bottom left, this is what I call open market sourcing, and it's simply a sequence of transactional relationships from the farm level to farmers to originators and traders to processors, ultimately to wholesale. And these, this is a linear progression, and there's, as you can appreciate, significant waste and inefficiency in this type of a model. When we talk about dedicated supply chain models, it's really where farmers and originators and traders and processors begin to align themselves and begin to work in a more coordinated, cohesive fashion, coming together, typically driven by a captain, by a supply chain captain, typically a brand owner, someone downstream that can ultimately look back up to the supply level and be able to implement and harness the resources, implement the alignment and the incentives that will help each of the stakeholders in the supply chain participate. So this depends on close, formalized cooperation from one end to the other. And as I said earlier, it's only as strong as the weakest link. What we're seeing come out of this is the formation of more multi-year supply agreements and really a focus on not just price, but how do stakeholders add value throughout the chain. So again, it's not about chasing price. I think the value proposition for dedicated supply chains has 5 drivers: reduce risk, improve productivity, improve access to capital, access new markets, and enhance the reputation of the brand and the stakeholders. And let's face it, today, big brands with the impact of social media today, I'm not thinking just beverage companies, but brand owners in F&A today are far more aware and feel vulnerable to the impacts of social media if they aren't truly aligned in their supply systems, and if they don't have full transparency all the way back to the farm level. I think it's not just about food safety or security of supply and managing volatility, but it's all of those together. I think this is what keeps CEOs of food and beverage companies awake at night. Focusing on sustainability throughout the supply chain, is clearly one of the most important drivers. And this is an example of 3 companies, Unilever, McDonald's, and Danone, that have each made ambitious and set ambitious goals for sustainability throughout their supply chain. Most of you are familiar with Unilever, and obviously sourcing sustainably is very important to the company. They've had a very publicly stated mission toward that, and I think they've really set the bar for their peers. But interestingly, McDonald's also has a very deep focus on sustainability today and expects a great deal from its supply chain. I mean, it's to be a supplier to McDonald's, it's not about just delivering on price. There, you have to deliver on a whole host of attributes, including innovation, and being able to innovate not just within your area of responsibility, but to enable the entire supply chain to share in that innovation process. Danone also very innovative. I think about what they've done with fluid milk in the U.S., where they condense milk in Kansas so that they can ship to Texas to make yogurt. Back in Kansas, they take the water out of fluid dairy and reuse that water. So they create a more efficient supply for yogurt production into Texas by condensing the water and using it in Kansas. So very innovative, simple things, but ones that have tremendous impact when you start to roll that out across a company and system like Danone. But engaging with small stakeholders is equally important. I might argue, I think it's more important, because this is kind of the critical stage where small stakeholders have so much at risk. And when you talk about dedicated supply chains, I think it's easy to think that as a small stakeholder, I can't participate. How can it change the way I do business? These 3 companies have had tremendous initiative. Mars, obviously, with cocoa farmers in West Africa. Nestle, as I referred to, their basmati rice production in Pakistan, really built around a smallholder commitment, and the Coca-Cola Company with Project Nurture in developing mango production. These are great examples of how small stakeholders participate. But to do so, I think there are really 3 enablers for small stakeholders. First, it's access to information. It's information and innovation. It's having a trusted advisor, and it's having capital, working capital. And it's obviously a chicken and egg. Which comes first? I think about access to innovation, and I think for small stakeholders, what could be more empowering than mobile banking? Thinking about working capital and warehousing finance schemes, these are critical to being able to give small stakeholders a chance to participate in supply chain management. And lastly, having a trusted advisor. I think when you look back at Mars and Coke and Nestle, that's truly the value they bring, is the knowledge and the ability to harness resources and affect change. But small stakeholders are a very important part of this. And the solutions for them are a little bit different. And I've identified what I think are kind of 3 different ways that smallholders can actually have impact in a supply chain. And these 3 are physical control, market power, and what I call adaptive strategies. And in physical control, we talk about investing upstream, basically putting the farmer first, backwards integration, being able to joint venture or own a part of your supply chain all the way back to the farm level, because that is the way you get a true alignment between stakeholders further downstream. Market power is a different approach, and this is typically one that big brand owners use because they have market power. The market, needs them perhaps more than they need the market. And I think about companies like Coca-Cola and Danone and other big brand owners that really use market power. And how do they do that? It's really creating first they have market-based risk tools, right? They use hedging. But in addition, supply contracting, longer-term contracts is an obvious way that market power facilitates these dedicated supply chain sharing. Brand power, very important. And then lastly, forward integration, where some brand owners are investing not as much upstream but downstream with their distribution systems to get that same alignment. Lastly, adaptive strategies. I mean, these are typically for smaller holders, don't have brand power, may not have the financial resources to exert physical control. An adaptive strategy here is really like tolling or co-packing, is a way that in outsourcing, playing a much needed role as an outsourcer, and also ingredient substitution. Typically in the beverage industry, when commodity costs, say an apple juice concentrate, go up, there are adaptive strategies of finding a substitute for that product can be used to ensure that you're not sacrificing the quality of the product, but adapting to the changing market demands of price and volatility. I mentioned Mars. I think they've had a remarkable program in Pakistan with their basmati rice farmers. Here they've really gone from nearly 30 farmers to over 70. They've effectively tripled output by partnering with Bayer to develop fertilizers and training of fertilizer use that meets EC standards to effectively increase yields and triple rice output over a 2-year period of time. And I think this is a great example of how small stakeholders partnering with a big brand owner can achieve shared goal of greater yield, more consistent output, mitigating the volatility, and ensuring security of supply. I mentioned Nestle. Their initiatives in coffee production in the Philippines has really helped transform the Philippine coffee market, where they've doubled production from I believe it's 7,000 to almost 30,000. I'm sorry, 30,000 to 70,000, largely Robusta, but in doing so, creating a center of excellence for coffee growers who can now have access to, proper training and have the ability to develop a close working relationship with Nestle in a market that obviously sees tremendous growth in coffee. Lastly, Project Nurture, bringing passion to the passion fruit and mango business in the Coca-Cola supply chain. This is a unique combination of philanthropy, Bill and Melinda Gates, as well as TechnoServe and Sabco, the Coca-Cola company, a collective of 3 players with about $11–12 million invested around building better strategic sourcing for mango and passion fruit, and in doing so, creating economic value for small farmers in Uganda. What are the key benefits to small stakeholders for dedicated supply chains? I've tried to outline a few here. It's reduced risk from longer-term, more stable agreements that reduce exposure to price volatility. It's improved productivity. It's access to new markets, better insights downstream. This is really helping to drive product innovation and help companies grow their footprints into new markets. It's an enhanced brand and reputation. You know, companies that I mentioned have very ambitious CSR targets. This helps them achieve their goals in a sustainable way. And it's improved access to capital. Obviously, in addition to better cash flow and stronger credit ratings, you have transparency up and down the value chain. That helps you project your capital requirements more easily. It provides lenders with greater confidence that projections and budgets can be met and exceeded. And lastly, dedicated supply chains facilitate sharing of best practices. They strengthen downstream relationships, and they increase economic security for small stakeholders. Well, how do you get started? I think first and foremost, you have to engage the chain. You have to make a concerted effort to understand who your stakeholders are in the supply chain, and you have to engage them. You have to engage in that dialogue to understand, you know, what are their needs, what are their barriers, and how can you, as a captain, overcome them with the collective help of those up and down the supply chain. I think from that, you forge mutual value propositions. You have to find that balance between buyer and seller and understand what motivates each one, what you have in common, and how you can use those to achieve shared value beyond just price. I think thirdly, you have to live up to it. You have to, you know, make that ambitious statement and objective, but then you have to put your words into action by actually getting out there, crafting the supply agreements, and doing that in a way that there's A, alignment, B, incentive. And because without one, you can't, you know, you won't get the other. So you have to have alignment and incentive. And last but not least, I think you have to monitor it fairly and objectively and be honest with your own company, with your other stakeholders about what the expectations are, and measure those and communicate those across the value chain.